Alright, hello everyone. We are coming in for this week's next video, for the video for this coming week. So for this week's video, it's going to be kind of a topic that I don't think gets a whole lot of attention, but it certainly probably has now since there is an ongoing war going on in Ukraine, which, in all honesty, I don't know. Cannot understand for the life of me why people cannot see the danger that letting Russia take Ukraine poses. But I guess they'll figure that out when it happens, and then they'll be regretting it. But that's a whole nother matter. So for the topic of today's video, I decided we wanted to take a look at something that we call the Holodomor, or the Great Famine in Ukraine that happened during the wider Soviet famine during the 1930s. And the Holodomor was a little bit different from what we know of now, because while there was widespread famine in the Soviet Union during its prior to World War II, mostly as a result of the policies of Joseph Stalin, the Holodomor is slightly different because this famine seemed to particularly target the Ukrainian people. It didn't, so some of the laws and political actions that were put in place by the Soviet regime seemed to specifically target the Ukrainians more than any other ethnic minority. And there are many countries today that do generally, and there is evidence to back this up in large degree, but there are many countries today who consider the Holodomor, as the Ukrainians call it, they consider it very much to be a genocide. And up until 2014, Russia actually itself was somewhat reminiscent and actually admitting to this fact. And then once the whole Crimea and Russo-Ukrainian conflict really began, about 2014, when Crimea gets seized, Russia very quickly starts reversing on that course and outright denying it. Very similar to how Turkey has a debate today with Armenia over whether or not the removal of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire during World War I was a genocide. All evidence I have seen would indicate that it definitely was at least some sort of genocide. Whether or not it was on a mass or limited scale is regardless. It still counts as a genocide if you're deliberately removing and essentially killing people of a certain minority or ethnicity or religious view or whatever it may be. And that's another genocide that perhaps one of these days we shall go over, is the Armenian genocide and the whole thing that comes from that. But for the purpose of today, we want to go over the Holodomor. And the Holodomor gets its name from a combination of two Ukrainian words, from Holod, which is the Ukrainian word for hunger, and from Mor, which was their word for extermination. And it has, of course, its cause, as with the wider Soviet famine that was going on at this time in the then Soviet Union, with the agricultural policies of collectivization that had been enacted by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who had been in power since at least the early 1920s after Vladimir Lenin's death in 1924. And Stalin had risen to power. He rapidly ousted all of his political rivals within the Kremlin, within the upper ranks of the Soviet Communist Party, because by then it's no longer the Bolsheviks, it's now the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And Stalin is very much in full leadership and control of the Soviet Union by the mid to late 1920s. He had ousted all of his political rivals, and some of them he had, of course, sent to gulags, his little network of camps that he had up in Siberia, to basically work you to death. Or he would just order political hits and assassinations on anybody that got away from him, like he later did with Trotsky, which is another story. But when Stalin came to power, the Soviet Union is a brand new nation. It has not really been about for that long. Mind you, the Russian Revolution that had deposed the Imperial Russian Empire and disposed the Tsar that we had covered back in December, that had happened in only 1917. And this is only roughly not even 10 years later quite yet. Maybe about a decade has passed. Mind you, after the Bolsheviks took power in late 1917, they managed to have a whole Russian Civil War go on until about 1922, and it was only then that the Soviet Union was proclaimed in December of that year. So the Soviet Union is a brand new nation, and although it is a new nation, it is struggling with the factor that a majority of the Soviet Union, despite it comprising many other Soviet republics, whether they were voluntary or forced, they still suffered from the fact that all these were part of the former Russian Empire, and the Russian Empire had never really fully industrialized. It had never gotten up to the same length of technological advancement as the West had. Stalin very much wanted to reverse this almost from the start because he realized that was a weakness of the new Soviet state. If we wanted to be on par with the West and be able to spread our communist revolution to the worldwide globe, we need to get up in advancement just as well as the Western nations are to show that communism is a true way of life and not inferior to what as these Westerners would claim. Among that, he also wanted to demonstrate what he viewed was superiority over Western democratic nations. So Stalin begins the process of actually trying to industrialize the Soviet Union, and he does so. Actually, he does accomplish the industrialization that Russia needs. However, he does it in such brutal ways in most times that it ends up killing quite a few people in order to achieve it so quickly. So there is a human cost to the industrialization that occurs in Soviet Russia about the 1920s, 1930s. And the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, as part of a policy that they called collectivization. It was a policy to basically revamp the Soviet Union's agriculture and get it onto footing with the West. And one way that they wanted to do this was enforce the main rules of communism, which there can be no private property. There can be no private ownership in communism. And as part of the collectivization process, Communist Party agitators would force local peasants, be it anywhere in the Soviet Union, but we're taking Ukraine in this instance, they would force the local peasants to relinquish any land that they owned, any personal property, and housing to collective firms. These collective firms would then take that and say, this is now property of the Soviet government, and this is for all people, not just one person. Wealthier peasants like kulaks and peasants who resisted were often deported just to get them out of there because they could actually resist a little bit because they had some money and power, and some who would straight out resist often were deported or executed if they could be. Now, collectivization, because of the implementation of this, it caused a drop in the production in the production of food, in the production of crops. It caused a drop in food supply as a consequence. And because of these, it begins to disrupt the rural economy, which back then at least, and it could be somewhat same now, a good majority of what was Soviet Ukraine was rural. It wasn't big cities everywhere. In fact, most of the Soviet Union was that way. But collectivization, it basically, you could grow your own crops, yes, but they're not guaranteed to be yours because almost as soon as they would come up and be ready to be harvested, here comes the Communist Party agents and everything else that would come and take all that you spent all summer growing and take it all to government warehouses and stores. You don't get to have a bit of it. It stars you out out of your hard-earned work. Now, peasant rebellions would also occur as a result of the implementation of collectivization, which had actually begun in the late 1920s. It wasn't something that just occurred as in the 30s, but by the time the Holodomor comes around. It didn't start as that. But as a consequence of collectivization and the peasants getting irate that they're doing all this work only to not be able to reap the benefits of their own work, peasant rebellions begin to occur throughout the Soviet Union in places where collectivization is really being enforced. And perhaps one of the areas that saw the worst amount of peasant rebellions was in Ukraine. Now, this is possibly where the thought of a Ukrainian genocide came from, because Stalin is worried by these peasant uprisings that are occurring in Ukraine. Because if you may remember, if you happen to watch our videos on the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War, we had mentioned that back when the Russian Civil War had occurred, mostly because the Russian Revolution was a little lax first, but there were several nations who declared independence from the former Imperial Russian Empire that actually managed to, very early on try to form their own independent countries. Some of those countries would eventually come about, such as Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They would all get, and half of Poland, we'll say, because it was technically split between three. But those countries managed to declare their independence and managed to actually defend it and keep it and get established. Ukraine had also been one of those countries that had declared independence when the Tsar was overthrown. In 1917, they proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic is what was proclaimed. However, the Bolsheviks, upon attaining power back in Moscow and Russia, they wanted to try to hold all these countries that had been part of the Russian Empire together in this grand conglomeration, and they very quickly invaded Ukraine and deposed this short-lived republic state that was being established there. The Ukrainians did fight against the Soviet Red Army during the Russian Civil War, and white forces were very prevalent in Ukraine, where they had much support initially. So Stalin is worried by the early 1930s because he is remembering that during the Russian Civil War, Ukraine had been the hardest of all the countries to really get to come into the Soviet fold because it really didn't want to. It was kind of forced, which is another derogative to Putin's narrative that, oh no, it's always been part of Russia. Well, not really, Putin, because the moment that the Ukrainians were given the chance to either stay with Russia or try to go out on their own, they decided, we're done with you. And they tried to go out on their own, and then you forced them back in, much like he's trying to do now. But the whole concept to Stalin that the Ukrainians have been a problem in the past. They've tried to assert independence in the past. They have fought us since they've been integrated back into the Soviet Union. There's still been uprisings that have occurred in Ukraine against Soviet rule. Stalin is concerned that these peasant uprisings are going to lead to a wider Ukrainian revolution that will finally see Ukraine break free of Soviet control and lead to another war that he is not really in the mood for doing because he's trying to focus on domestic matters. Mind you, Stalin is an evil dude. I mean, I'm not. If I come across as not criticizing him enough, I apologize. But we're looking more at the direct genocide here and what actually happened. Of course, you could go much more in depth. Joseph Stalin, I would put up there in the top. In my book, we'll go with top 10 because if I really want to go top 5, I mean, really got to do a thorough investigation of that one. But there's a good possibility he'd be in that too. But he'd be among the top 10 at least worst dictators in world history. Him and Hitler, Stalin might have been our ally during World War II, but it was only because we had a common enemy. In many ways, he was just like Hitler, and in some ways, he was even worse. I'm not making a defense of that other man either, but comparing the two, they're very, very similar, so it's kind of odd that we even try to contrast the two. And Stalin was an absolute tyrant and authoritarian. There was nothing good about Stalin. And it's after Stalin comes to this realization that the Ukrainians are a possible threat and that unrest is brewing in Ukraine, he starts thinking about how can I quell this? Not to mention that the Ukrainians were also starting to even resist the state agricultural policy of Ukraine's official Communist Party that was a subdivision of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So in the autumn of 1932, the Soviet Politburo of elite leadership within the Soviet Communist Party, they made some decisions to specifically target and punish Ukraine and worsen the famine there specifically. They knew there was famine going on throughout the country, but Ukraine, they specifically wanted it to get worse as a punishment. That's a little twisted. And despite the growing starvation food requisitions that were being demanded because people were starving in Ukraine already from the famine. And these are just some things that kind of indicate this was done on purpose, despite the fact that starvation is rampant in Ukraine as in many other Soviet areas affected by famine. There are, of course, a increase in the request for food requisitions. And despite the increase of requisition requests, this aid was altogether in some cases not even provided, or too little was provided, if at all. And in many cases, they weren't provided at all to starve the Ukrainians out. And it reached its peak during the winter of 1932 to 33, when communist enforcers would actually go into peasant homes, ransack them, and take anything that was possibly edible from the Ukrainian peasants' homes. And I don't just mean food. They took food, they took crops, they took even their pets, because of the fear that eventually you're going to starve so much to death that that might be your family dog or your horse or your cat. But if you're that hungry, you know you got to eat to live. It's something to eat, and they would eat it. So the Soviet Communist Party agitators, in order to enforce this purposeful genocidal famine, when they came and ransacked the home, they even took your pets. They took any animal you had on the yard. Didn't matter if it was domesticated or whatever. that was a possible food source. Anything that you could eat, gone. They would just come into your home and ransack it and take it, which leads to an extermination of the Ukrainian people. And this is probably not going to be definitely the longest video because it's a brief overview here. But before we continue, I think we'll go ahead and show at least some of the images here that try to show this. So this is a map of what's the famine and who was affected in terms of population decline during the Soviet famine, and this is specifically looking at Ukraine during the 30s when Holodomor is happening. Now, mind you, the white provinces over here, the white provinces at the time were actually part of other countries. Be it up here, they would have been part of pre-World War II Poland. So these are not counted because they were not technically part of the Soviet state at that time. But anything that's in color was part of the Soviet state. The dark red, of course, is the worst. And if we really look, a lot of red, specifically in Ukraine, a little bit down here near Georgia and Armenia, but a lot of red over here. But look at neighboring Belarus. There's famine, yes, but it's in the yellow. There's no red. Even in Russia, orange. Mostly down here in the Caucasus and Ukraine. And if you also want to notice something, and this was another habit that Stalin kind of had that has influenced the conflict today. Look at eastern Ukraine, right where most of the territory is that Russia has either claimed wants to be independent or has occupied to this day. Look at all this. There's a lot of red there, isn't it? That is also, coincidentally, one of the things that Stalin did after this Holodomor starts going on. He purposely is killing off Ukrainians, and then, once the Ukrainians have died in those areas, he's forcing, not even so much forcing, but encouraging Russian people from Russia to go and settle in Ukraine in these areas that just had a whole massive die-off of ethnic Ukrainians, to settle in, as he called it, Russify Ukraine, to get more Russians in Ukraine so that it was less Ukrainian, and to subvert Ukrainian culture, which we'll also discuss here in just a second. And I'll be very surprised here, but those are the same regions that today, with the supposed republics of Luhansk and Donetsk and Luhansk, that Putin claims is partly why he's in this war, though we all know why he's in this war if we're watching the news, or if we're just thinking with our own minds. I mean, think with your own minds for a second. Why would a dictator invade another country? It doesn't take that much. It doesn't take that much thought to really realize they're after power. They're after a global empire. Putin has been looking at this for well over 10 years. He knew what he was doing. He's claimed those republics for over 10 years. And why? Because Ukraine had gotten rid of a pro-Russian president, and it had become closer to the West, and he didn't like that. But that's a whole... that gets much longer into the field. So it's no ironic that those same regions that Putin claimed, there's a bunch of pro-Russian separatists and everything else, there is a bunch of ethnic Russians out there. There is. There is sizable Russian minorities in those areas of Ukraine. Why? Because of Stalin and the Holodomor. By getting rid of the ethnic Ukrainians there, by killing them off, and then sending Russians in there to settle in their place. Here's a group of peasants wandering through the countryside in Ukraine during the Holodomor, just looking for food. I mean, they're traveling, they're trying to just find anything they can eat. And this was everywhere in Ukraine. It just wasn't one or two places. And there's a reason we don't have the best of photographs at times for the Holodomor. Here is an image of one of the collectivization wagon trains that would come through into villages and everything else. This was part of the Soviet government's effort to enforce collectivization in Ukraine. And they'd come in, take all your crops, all your food, all your produce, anything that was of value or of food making, and it would now become part of the government's own stores, and you wouldn't be able to use a lick of it. This was what was being enforced. It was already starting to starve the Ukrainian people out. Here we have a picture of some women walking along the streets in Kharkiv, I believe, or Kharkiv, however they say it. And you got two men who they say are just simply exhausted from the famine, but in my opinion, they could also be dead, just in the streets because of the widespread famine. Just two of them, either they're so tired that they're just fallen and collapsed on the street, or they're dead and died there. So Stalin's campaign against Ukraine caused disaster throughout the Soviet Republic, and it spiked a massive increase in the death rate within Soviet Ukraine. Between 1931 and 1934, 5 million people perished in the Soviet Union from famine. But during that same time frame, with 5 million killed, 3.9 million of that 5 million, so almost 4 million, so that's 4/5 of the people that died were Ukrainians. Take that into account. 5 million died in roughly 3 or 4 year period. But out of those who died, out of the 5 million, almost 4 million were Ukrainians, not Russians, not Belarusians, not Georgians, not Armenians, Ukrainians. But yet, if they're all getting affected, you would think, why is it mostly Ukrainians? They're the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Why are they having a famine that bad? Police records that would indicate what had gone on during the Holodomor also have given us some of the grimmer aspects that I didn't really want to bring into photo-wise because, I mean, there are photos of deliberate corpses. I mean, that one may be a corpse, but we're not 100% certain. But there are actual photos of corpses on the ground, and I just didn't want to bring those into play. But police records indicated that there were instances in Ukraine during the Holodomor of cannibalism, theft, lawlessness, lynchings, anything, the breakdown of society, pretty much, during this whole thing. And mass graves were commonplace as people died, which is what this photo would be of. This was a mass grave outside Kharkiv of just Ukrainians who had died in the Holodomor, and they're just burying them in mass burials because there's so many dead. Now, the Ukrainian cities, however, were not as badly affected as the rural countryside. They were definitely affected, as we see in the one photo from Kharkiv. I mean, you got people on the street, but they were not as adversely affected because they're also a city, and they were still able to, in the Ukrainian cities, they were still able to somewhat survive on local ration cards that were allowed in the local cities, but bodies in the streets were still a common occurrence in the Ukrainian cities during that time. The Soviet government used the famine particularly to assault Ukraine's cultural identity during that same time. As we mentioned, Stalin deliberately moved Russians into Ukraine to try to Russify the country. As a part of the Russification process that Stalin had put in place in Ukraine, there was an attack on the Ukrainian political system. The political establishment was pretty much brought down, and it was Russified to the extent that you had Russian members now representing in the Ukrainian Communist Party, Russian members, Russian people in the certain places of power within the Ukrainian local governments to kind of influence those. There was persecution and repression of common Ukrainian culture. So, like common Ukrainian dishes were somewhat discouraged. Not that you could really have them. The Ukrainian language, which had been encouraged through a process of official Ukrainization in Ukraine, was the Soviet government, since it had first been founded, had actually encouraged people in Ukraine to learn and use the native Ukrainian language, was officially ended during the Stalin years, and it was actually encouraged that you learn Russian. So there is an attack on Ukrainian culture because they're trying to basically break down the Ukrainian political system that exists on the local level. At the same time, they're discouraging the Ukrainians from even speaking their own language. They're attacking them, treating them as second-class citizens in accordance with these Russian settlers who are now coming in and settling in these newly freed areas where people had just died in mass droves. There is an systematic attack on Ukrainian culture during the Holodomor that occurs by the Soviet government, and in particular because Stalin saw it as a punishment, as some sort of punishment. That's what he ultimately saw it as. As a further effort to try to punish the Ukrainians and try to discourage any sort of rebellion from happening against the Soviet state. Stalin also saw to it that any people in Ukraine who had partaken in the short-lived Ukrainian People's Republic back in 1917 during the Russian Civil War and Russian Revolution, that anyone who had taken part in that government or anyone that had taken part in establishing that regime would be targeted for reprisal. Many of the people that had actually were found to have participated in that were actually sent to the gulags in Siberia as political prisoners. Knowing that Stalin's Russification of Ukraine would eventually even reach the Ukrainian Communist Party, the one of the main leaders of that party, Mykola Shripnik, was a prominent member of the Ukrainian Communist Party, but he was Ukrainian himself. Knowing that Stalin would eventually get so paranoid that he would probably go after the Ukrainian Communist Party, that was an offshoot of the Soviet Communist Party, he actually committed suicide. Shripnik did, just to avoid going through one of Stalin's show trials where he would simply be executed at the end, regardless of whether or not he was innocent of whatever he was charged with. Soviet bureaucrats would silence the news of the famine throughout the country and throughout the world, and party officials wouldn't even mention it when they would meet for government official business. Western journalists who happened to visit the Soviet Union at this time, mostly in Moscow, were instructed not to write about the famine in order to keep it hidden from the wider world at the time. One of the few exceptions was a young journalist by the name of Gareth Jones, as he published about a whole article about the famine once he got out of the Soviet Union, and he managed to actually take photographs. And he was suspiciously ended up being murdered in Mongolia in 1935, just 2 years after. So he was the only one to really do it. And because he was really the only report, some people in large amount, the Western world, although they kind of got a hint that something was going on in the Soviet Union in terms of Soviet famine, and maybe it was very particularly bad in Ukraine, they didn't really get the broader picture that this was an ongoing mass genocide attempt. And because of that, there is very much the problem where the Western world ignored the Holodomor for almost pretty much until the end of the Soviet Union or the late 1980s, and until that becomes a much more open and talked about subject. So kind of like the Holocaust, where there were signs beforehand that we knew something was going on in Nazi-ruled lands, that they were doing something with the Jewish people, and at one point we kind of had a good idea what they might be doing, but we didn't get the final confirmation and full picture until we actually went in and started liberating Europe, and we found all these, death camps and concentration camps and the pure evidence of what the Nazis had been doing with the Jewish people and with homosexuals and with anyone that they deemed as basically undesirable. But the same thing with Ukraine and the Holodomor. This was something that was not talked about. It was something that was repressed, that was not allowed to be talked about publicly. Stalin even went so far as to repress any news about the Holodomor and the Soviet famine, that when in 1937 a census was taken that showed the decimation of the Ukrainian population, partly because and mostly because of the Holodomor, Stalin had the administrators who had been in charge of this census were arrested and then executed simply because they had showed the actual truth, to hide it from the world and repress it further. The people that were conducting a census of the population, simply because they noted that there was a massive population decline, got arrested and murdered simply because they were doing their job. The famine would be scarcely discussed openly during the Nazi occupation of Ukraine during World War II, which happened off and on, and that also explains. And I'm not trying to say, no, the Ukrainians did not willingly want to side with the Nazis here. They were invaded themselves and didn't really have much of a choice. But there were Ukrainians who, at first, saw the Nazis as liberators because they were tired of Soviet rule. And at first, they thought, well, the Germans will, let us be our own people and they'll let us be a little bit more free. So there were Ukrainians who, at first, when Nazis came and invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, there were Ukrainians who aided the Germans as they came in, only to later find out that the Germans were no different than Stalin and were actually going to start persecuting Jewish and other people who are undesirable, and that public opinion very rapidly turned around, just like any other nation that might have at first been not so hostile to the German invasion. The first public mention of the Holodomor wouldn't actually come until 1986. It was a taboo subject in Ukraine and in the Soviet Union until then, And it really didn't start being talked about again until 1986, because in Ukraine, you had the instance of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which the Soviets also tried to cover up and hide a little information about. And because this was happening during the time of glasnost, openness that Mikhail Gorbachev had basically instituted into the Soviet Union, there was a little bit more free public discussion about this issue. And as a consequence, some of them started remembering how the government had hidden and tried to cover up the famine back in the 1930s, and how that had kind of exterminated their own people, the Holodomor, as they had called it. The Kremlin actually denied the Holodomor for well over 50 years, and now, since Russia and Ukraine are at conflict again, they are once again trying to deny that it actually happened. But it plays an important role in the modern Ukrainian cultural memory. Ukrainian poet Ivan Drak was the first one to speak publicly about the Holodomor back in 1986 after Chernobyl, citing it specifically as an example of the dangers of official silence when these things are going on by the government. Monuments to the Holodomor have also been erected in Ukraine since its independence in 1991, and I believe it was 1998 that Ukraine officially designated a Holodomor Remembrance Day, which has come to be recognized by many countries across the world, specifically the ones that recognize it as a genocide. And that is celebrated worldwide on the fourth Saturday of November each year as a Remembrance Day. As there is a Holocaust Remembrance Day, there is also a Holodomor Remembrance Day as well. And that, I think, is this all I have here for it. There is a lot more with the Holodomor and other Soviet crimes that you could really go into, and the way they treated some ethnic minorities within their country. But that is one that I wanted to bring up, especially since Ukraine and Russia are once again at it, and it has a little bit of a relation to that ongoing conflict. Of course, if you want to learn more about it, I encourage you to look it up yourself. It's actually quite fascinating to see how this was kind of covered up, and then how it was such a taboo subject for a long time that people were afraid to even talk about it in any manner, even though after Glasnost they were encouraged somewhat to be a little bit more open, but that fear was still there. So that concludes for this week's video. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, anything of that nature, be sure to leave that in the comments section. I'll be sure to go through it. As for next week, I do not know what video we're doing yet. I think I have a good idea what I'm going to do. It's going to revolve most likely around the Titanic, since we're coming up on the 112th anniversary this weekend of that sinking. So it'll be having something to do with the Titanic disaster, I can tell you that much. I just got to make sure I can work it the way I want to work it. So that concludes for this week. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week. And we'll see you all back here next week for our next video, which will concern something along the lines of a detail with the related Titanic disaster. So until then, may everyone stay well, and hopefully everyone has a good day.